The photograph had survived fire, flood, and the careless hands of time. Taken in 1878, it showed a boy no older than 10, standing stiffly before a painted studio backdrop, his boots polished, his collar starched too tightly around a thin neck. He held a cane almost as tall as he was, both hands resting atop it as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about him. Children in that era were often dressed like small adults, their smiles held by long exposure times and stricter manners. This boy did not smile at all. When the restoration began, the archivist noted how unusually dark the original plate was, as though the light had been swallowed before it reached the lens. Dust and cracks were removed digitally, inch by inch, revealing textures, long buried fabric threads, scuffed leather, the faint grain of the backdrop. Then something else appeared, a shadow behind the boy's left shoulder, too sharp to belong to him, too deliberate to be a flaw. It seemed to lean closer with each correction, its outline growing clearer as the image improved. The cane drew attention next. Its surface, once smooth, revealed faint carvings along the shaft, symbols worn down by small, nervous hands. The handle, partially obscured in the original, now showed a shape that was never meant to be decorative. It resembled a face, elongated, hollow-eyed, its mouth pressed shut, as if bound by the boy's grip. The longer one stared, the more it felt as though the cane was being restrained, not used. There was a final moment before the archivist halted the process, a sudden chill settling in the room. The restored image now showed the boy's eyes with startling clarity. They were not focused on the camera. They were fixed on something just beyond it, something standing where the photographer once had. And behind him, the shadow no longer looked like a trick of light at all, but like a second presence, patiently waiting for the boy to loosen his hands. The photograph returned to the world, but accident, pulled from obscurity during a routine cataloging of forgotten glass plates stored beneath a provincial museum. It had been mislabeled decades earlier, tucked between landscapes and civic portraits, its envelope browned and brittle, the handwritten date barely legible. 1878, no name, no location. The image itself appeared harmless at first glance, almost dull in its formality. A young boy posed in a studio, dressed with care that suggested either wealth or mourning, holding a cane that seemed far too old for him. The staff member who found it assumed it was another example of Victorian stiffness, a child made to stand still long enough for the camera to steal his likeness. What drew attention was not the subject, but the condition. Despite its age, the plate had survived unusually well, with none of the warping or chemical bleed common to photographs from that period. The damage it did show was oddly selective, concentrated around the edges and the darker regions of the frame, as though time itself had avoided the boy. This anomaly prompted the decision to send it for higher resolution restoration, not out of curiosity but preservation. The process was supposed to be clinical, detached, governed by software and method. No one expected discovery, only clarity. As the restoration request was logged, a junior archivist attempted to cross-reference the image with census records, studio registries, anything that might attach a name to the face. There was nothing. No listing of a child photographed with a cane that year, no corresponding family portrait, no duplicate prints. It was as if the photograph existed in isolation, a single surviving echo of a moment never recorded elsewhere. Even the studio backdrop, usually identifiable by pattern or wear, matched no known photographer's work from the region. The harmlessness of the image began to feel rehearsed, like a deliberate disguise. The boy's posture was too formal, his hands positioned with unnatural care, fingers interlocked atop the cane as if instructed to never let go. His expression was neither fearful nor calm, but emptied of childhood altogether. When the plate was scanned and enlarged for the first time, several staff members remarked on an unshakable sense of being observed, though no one could explain why. It was dismissed as imagination, the power of suggestion working backward from an old image. Only later did someone notice the faint notation etched into the glass itself, invisible unless caught at a certain angle under direct light. A single word, scratched so lightly it could have been mistaken for a fracture, written in a hand far less practiced than the photographer's. It was not a name nor a date, but a warning, placed where no casual viewer would ever think to look, as if whoever left it believed the photograph would one day be found again and feared what might happen when it was finally seen. The restoration advanced slowly, each adjustment revealing details that had been dulled by time rather than erased. At first, the changes were expected ones: sharper contrast in the boy's coat, the faint weave of the backdrop cloth, the scuffed toes of his boots. But as the damaged regions were corrected, something began to emerge that did not align with the physics of light or the logic of the studio. Behind the boy's left shoulder, where the background should have remained flat and uniform, a darker form surfaced, its edges unnervingly precise. It did not blur or soften the way shadows usually did in 19th century photography. Instead, it appeared to sharpen as clarity improved, as though it had been waiting for the image to be seen properly. The technicians initially assumed it was a chemical artifact, a stain created by uneven exposure or aging silver. Yet when they attempted to isolate it, the shape resisted categorization. It maintained its proportions regardless of contrast changes, never dissolving into noise. When the background was reconstructed digitally, the shape persisted, embedded too deeply to be dismissed as damage. It seemed to occupy space, not on the surface of the plate, but within the scene itself, positioned deliberately just out of focus. As more layers were restored, the form gained definition. It stretched upward, taller than the boy, tapering near the top like a head bent forward in attention. The area where a face should have been remained indistinct, yet the suggestion of features lingered, implied by absence rather than presence. The most unsettling detail was its direction. The shadow did not fall away from the boy as light would dictate. It leaned toward him, converging at his shoulder, as if anchored there by something unseen. Discomfort spread through the restoration lab, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Conversations dropped in volume, and no one worked alone on the image anymore. When viewed on a large monitor, the shadow seemed to change depending on who stood before it, its outline appearing sharper from certain angles, softer from others, creating the illusion of movement where none should exist. One technician swore that when she stepped away, the space behind the boy felt emptier, as though something had receded. Attempts were made to compare the shadow with known photographic anomalies from the era, including double exposures and background bleed. None matched. Even more troubling was the realization that the shadow respected the boy's silhouette perfectly, never overlapping his form, as if aware of his boundaries. It behaved less like a mistake and more like a presence that understood where it was allowed to exist. By the time the team reached the deepest levels of restoration, the shadow was no longer a vague shape, but an unmistakable second figure, standing just behind the boy, close enough that only a narrow sliver of light separated them, and in that narrow space, the air itself seemed to tighten, as though the photograph were holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the distance between them would finally disappear. Attention shifted inevitably to the cane once the shadow could no longer be ignored. What had seemed like a simple prop now felt central, almost deliberate in its placement. Early enlargements revealed faint irregularities along its length, shallow grooves that ran in uneven patterns from handle to tip. At first, they were dismissed as scratches, the result of age or careless handling. But as resolution increased, the marks resolved into shapes, repeated with subtle variations, as though carved by an unsteady hand that returned again and again to the same symbols. They did not match any known decorative style of the era, nor did they resemble common walking stick embellishments. They looked less ornamental and more instructional, as if meant to be followed by touch rather than sight. The handle proved more disturbing. Beneath layers of grime and chemical distortion, its shape emerged with unsettling clarity. It was not rounded or polished smooth like most canes of the time, but sculpted into an elongated form that suggested a face stretched thin. The eyes were nothing more than shallow hollows, asymmetrical and too deep for decoration. The mouth was a narrow groove pulled tight, not open in expression but compressed, as if forcibly closed. The boy's hands covered much of it, fingers curled with a tension that now felt defensive rather than posed. His grip was not gentle, it was restraining. As the restorers isolated the cane from the rest of the image, a pattern became impossible to ignore. The shadow behind the boy aligned with it, its darkest edge tracing the cane's upper curve as though the two were connected. Where the boy's hands touched the handle, the shadow thinned, almost recoiling, only to thicken again below his grip. This relationship suggested intent, a silent interaction frozen in time. The cane was not supporting the boy. The boy was containing something through it. Research into regional folklore was undertaken cautiously, framed as academic diligence rather than growing fear. Local legends from the late 19th century spoke of binding objects, items created to house or restrain malevolent forces when no other method was believed effective. These objects were often disguised as everyday tools, their true purpose hidden behind familiarity. Cane, staff, rod. The parallels were uncomfortable. More unsettling still was the belief that such objects required constant contact. If the bearer loosened their hold, even briefly, the restraint would fail. The boy's posture began to make sense in a way no one wanted to articulate aloud. His stiffness was not the result of a long exposure, but of effort. His downward gaze was not shyness, but concentration. Every detail of his pose suggested vigilance, a child forced into a role far beyond his years, standing still not for the camera, but because stillness was the only thing keeping whatever lay within the cane from emerging, and with that realization, the photograph no longer felt like a portrait at all, but a record of a moment balanced on the edge of release. The search for records began as a way to ground the growing unease in something factual. Names, dates, causes, anything that could pull the photograph back into the realm of documented history. Parish registries were examined first, then census rolls, school ledgers, burial records. Slowly, a pattern surfaced. In the year following the photograph's date, a boy of matching age and description vanished from the surrounding district without explanation. There was no death certificate, no record of relocation, only a brief note in a town ledger marking him as unaccounted for, a term rarely used and even more rarely followed up. The absence felt deliberate, as though someone had chosen erasure over acknowledgement. Attention then turned to the adults connected to the image. The photographer's name, once identified through equipment markings, led to a narrow window of activity before his sudden death. Officially, it was listed as illness, but the symptoms recorded by the attending physician were inconsistent and alarming: extreme exhaustion, panic, and an insistence that something was standing behind him even in empty rooms. 2 assistants who worked in the same studio died within a decade, both under circumstances ruled accidental. One fell down a stairwell after claiming he could no longer feel his hands. The other drowned in shallow water, though witnesses said he fought as if restrained. Each individual shared one detail. They had all handled the photograph directly at some point, either during development, printing, or cataloging. None of them were related, none lived near each other, yet their ends followed a strikingly similar progression: restlessness, paranoia, fixation on shadows, and finally, disappearance or death. It was as though the image carried something transferable, not contagious in a biological sense, but attentive, selective. The boy remained the greatest mystery. There were no schoolmates who remembered him clearly, only vague mentions of a quiet child who stood apart and never played. One account, recorded years later in a personal diary, described seeing him standing motionless near the edge of town, holding something long and dark, staring at nothing for hours. After that winter, he was never seen again. The diarist ended the entry by noting that the air felt lighter afterward, a strange relief settling over the streets that no one spoke about. What unsettled the researchers most was the timing. The disappearances did not occur immediately after the photograph was taken. They followed exposure, handling, attention. The more the image passed through human hands, the more frequently tragedy followed. It suggested that the photograph was not merely documenting an event, but participating in one, continuing a process that had begun in that studio long ago. By the time these connections were fully mapped, the restoration team realized that the photograph had already been touched too many times in the present, viewed on too many screens, studied too closely by people who now woke at night, convinced something was standing just beyond their line of sight, patiently waiting for the moment when someone, somewhere, would finally let go. The final stage of restoration was approached with a restraint that bordered on superstition. No one wanted to be responsible for uncovering whatever remained hidden, yet the process had already gone too far to stop. The last layer involved reconstructing the darkest portions of the image, areas previously left untouched because they resisted correction. As the software filled in the missing data, the space between the boy and the shadow changed first. What had once been a narrow band of darkness clarified into a shape that suggested separation, not emptiness but tension, like two forces pressed together but held apart by will alone. Then the boy's hands sharpened. Fine details emerged in his fingers, whitened knuckles, nails bitten short, skin pulled tight with effort. The cane beneath them appeared worn smooth where his palms had rested, polished not by age but by constant pressure. Just below his grip, the carvings deepened, no longer faint symbols but deliberate markings that formed a boundary line, as though everything above it was restrained and everything below it was waiting. The handle's face, once ambiguous, now looked unmistakably strained, its closed mouth warped as if pressed from within. What finally stopped the room was the revelation in the boy's expression. Earlier restorations had focused on clarity, but now intention emerged. His eyes were not simply fixed on something beyond the camera. They carried exhaustion, the kind that comes not from fear but from endurance. This was not a child caught in a frightening moment. This was a child at the end of his strength. The photograph had captured him not at the beginning of a duty, but at the brink of failure. Behind him, the shadow completed itself. It was no longer a vague outline, but a figure shaped by proximity, its form constrained only where the boy stood. One arm-like extension reached forward, stopping just short of his shoulder, as if testing the boundary. The cane aligned perfectly with the figure's center, acting not as a tool, but as a lock. It became clear then that the boy was not protecting himself. He was protecting everything else. A final anomaly appeared only after the image was rendered complete. Reflected faintly in the polished surface of the cane's shaft was a distortion that did not match the studio or the boy. It suggested open space, movement, and depth beyond the frame, as though the photograph were a doorway held shut by the smallest possible margin. The implication was unmistakable. The moment the boy could no longer hold on, whatever was bound within the image would no longer remain confined to it. The restoration log ended abruptly after that discovery. No final notes were entered, no official conclusions drawn. The image was archived without publication, sealed away under restricted access. Yet copies had already been made, fragments cached in systems and screens, viewed by people who would later swear that shadows in their own rooms no longer behaved correctly, and that somewhere in the unseen distance behind them, something was no longer being held back.